plague and pestilence in the Forgotten Realms. When a well goes bad in a village in the Western Heartlands, the people do not blame bad luck. When the crops rot in the fields despite favorable weather, they do not shrug. When the fever comes to a city and the priests cannot say where it came from or why this city, why this season, why these people and not those, the explanation is not chance, not bad drainage, not the accumulated consequence of bodies too close together for too long in a walled space without enough clean water. The explanation is Talona. She is the Lady of Poison, the Mistress of Disease, the Mother of all Plagues. She is depicted in religious texts as a gaunt 10-foot crone with unkempt hair and elongated fingers that reach toward whatever she touches, with a face scarred and tattooed into something barely recognizable as human. She carries a cup or a vase, and in that vessel she holds all the varieties of disease and poison that the world has known or will know. The 3 drops of her holy symbol, 3 droplets arranged in a triangle, appear on the doors of infected houses, on the mouths of sick children, on the lips of tainted wells. The ritual of 3 drops of blood or tears offered to placate her is practiced by people who have never set foot in a Talonite temple and would burn one down if they found it in their city. Fear is worship. Talona accepts both equally. This is the world of disease and plague in the Forgotten Realms. Not a natural phenomenon operating without divine involvement, but a theological reality with a specific goddess behind it, a church dedicated to her service, a history of catastrophic outbreaks tied to her attention waxing and waning, and an entire ecology of rot and contagion that touches everything from the price of grain to the foreign policy of kingdoms. What follows is the story of Pestilence in Faerun, the goddess at its center, the people who serve her, the plagues that have shaped history, and what it means in a world where disease has a name and a face, and opinions about whether you have been paying her proper respect to live in a body that can be infected. The Lady of Poison, Talona's nature. She is one of the most prayed to deities in the entire Faerunian pantheon. That statement requires immediate clarification because the prayers are not devotion. Most people who invoke Talona's name are doing so the way you might appease an unpredictable neighbor who has previously set your house on fire, not because you love them, not because you have any illusions about what they are, but because the alternative is worse. Talona's divine personality is described by sages who have studied her with a remarkable consistency. She is a petulant, greedy child. She craves attention the way a child craves attention, not through the sustained and dignified desire for reverence that characterizes gods like Tyre or Helm, but through the immediate and demanding insistence that she be acknowledged, that her power be recognized, that no one be allowed to forget she exists. When the acknowledgement is sufficiently widespread, she retreats into a wounded aloofness, the sulking of someone who received attention but did not receive the specific quality of attention they wanted. Then the cycle begins again. This cycle is cosmological in its consequences. Talona's power waxes when plague is widespread and desperate people are praying to her constantly, pleading for the sickness to stop. When the plague ends, worship tapers off. People who are no longer sick stop dwelling on the goddess of sickness, and her divine power slowly diminishes. When she feels sufficiently diminished, she sends another plague which renews the worship, which renews her power, and the wheel turns again. The records of her peak veneration trace this pattern precisely. The year of clinging death in 75 DR, the year of the Queen's Tears in 902 DR, the year of the Scourge in 1150 DR, the double peak of the year of the Empty Goblet and the year of Beckoning Death in 1252 and 1253 DR, and the year of Dreamwebs in 1323 DR following the Great Plague of the Inner Sea. Each of these corresponds to a significant outbreak. Each of the outbreaks corresponds to a period when Talona's theological competitors were gaining ground. The theological competitors matter here. Talona despises Chantea, goddess of agriculture and the harvest, because healthy crops are the enemy of famine. She despises Mieliki, goddess of forests, because her portfolio is the living wilderness rather than the rotting wilderness. She despises Kelemvor, god of the dead, who offers orderly passage through death rather than the lingering, suffering, degrading process of fatal illness that Talona's diseases tend to produce. and she has a specific dislike for Ilmater, the crying god, deity of suffering and endurance, because Ilmater's clerics find cures. Every disease that Ilmater's followers treat successfully is a small defeat. Talona finds this personally irritating. Her relationship with Loviatar, the Maiden of Pain, is one of the more interesting interpersonal dynamics among the Faerunian deities. Both served Baal, the dead god of murder, before the time of troubles. Loviatar's portfolio is pain, and she is beautiful and sadistic in the specific way that cruelty made aesthetically palatable tends to be. Talona is ugly, in the mythology, the crone with the diseased face, the withered thing that brings rot wherever it goes. Loviatar tormented Talona constantly during their shared service to Baal, mocking her appearance, the smallness of her portfolio, the comparatively low number of her followers. Talona hated this. It contributed to the specific quality of wounded vanity that shapes her character. She is not simply malevolent in the way of Bane or Cyric. She is malevolent with grievances, which is a specific and more personal kind of malevolence. After Baal's death during the time of troubles, both Talona and Loviatar fell gradually into the orbit of Shar, the goddess of darkness and loss. The nature of this alliance is not simple devotion. Shar does not inspire simple devotion, but a recognition of shared interests and the specific kind of mutual usefulness that dark deities maintain when they are not actively trying to destroy each other. The Talantar, her church and its members. The clergy of Talona are called Talantar. Their laity, the broader body of devoted followers, are Talonites. The distinction matters because the Talantar live their faith in ways that are genuinely extreme, even by the standards of a religion centered on plague and poison, and the Talonites are the wider population of people with a deep enough relationship to the Lady of Poison to be considered something more than the desperate supplicants who pray to her during outbreaks. The most immediately visible thing about a Talantar, when you see one, is the body. Older and higher-ranking priests have ritual scars and tattoos across the entirety of their skin. The face, especially, but also the neck, arms, torso, back, all of it marked in patterns that encode devotion and power, and the specific history of the priest's relationship with the goddess. Some add piercings in their later years, small metal rings linked with fine chains so that the torso becomes studded with metal. The female clergy wear earrings and elbow pendants in black metal shaped like talons, the claw shape that is one of Talona's symbols. The vestments are gray-green robes, washed but never repaired. They are allowed to fray and fade and eventually reduce themselves to rags worn with a specific pride. The practical battle dress is black and purple armor adorned with spurs and horns and spikes. Priests of Talona carry daggers dipped in poison. The higher clergy have been known to carry blades dipped in the Chaos Curse, a particularly potent concoction with a history in the faith going back to the time of troubles. What the Talantar actually do in the world is one of the more genuinely strange aspects of the faith, because the activities of Talona's clergy are a mixture of the obviously sinister and the genuinely useful that makes them difficult to simply categorize as villains and leave it at that. They travel constantly and quietly. The baseline requirement of a Talonite priest is to seek out new diseases, to find afflictions that have not been cataloged, to document them, to understand how they spread and what they do and who survives and who does not. This is, in the most direct sense, the behavior of dedicated disease researchers, and the knowledge that Talonite priests accumulate over careers spent walking into plague zones that everyone else fled is genuinely valuable. They are immune to disease themselves, a divine blessing that makes them able to function in environments that would kill a priest of any other deity who attempted the same work. They also treat the sick. The Talantar's disease immunity, combined with the medical knowledge accumulated through a career of studying illness, makes them effective healers in practical terms. They bury the dead from plague outbreaks at times when no other priest is willing to touch the bodies. They take employment as food tasters for paranoid rulers and wealthy merchants, a lucrative and entirely legitimate service for someone who cannot be poisoned. And then there is the other side of the ledger. They sell poisons, described carefully as products for eliminating vermin rather than people, and the description is accurate enough of the time that it cannot simply be dismissed. They spread rumors about Talona's power, augmenting her reputation wherever they travel, which translates into fear and tribute that feeds her divine portfolio. When a city expels Talonite clergy for any reason, the church's response is to cause a plague in that city, to exact Talona's price for the insult, and to demonstrate to anyone watching what the price of casting out her representatives turns out to be. There have been documented instances of Talonites targeting wealthy individuals with disease, specifically to allow the church to seize properties and wealth upon their deaths, keeping rightful heirs away with the threat of contagion. The church's internal organization is strict but riven by factional disputes. Temples and shrines are hidden, located in catacombs beneath cities where they sit above reeking sewers, or in wilderness ruins near stagnant swamps and marshes heavy with insects and the smell of decay. The decorative theme is consistent: gargoyles and carvings depicting humans racked with disease, as if the entire architectural program is a catalog of the Talona due to a body. The central node of the church in the realms is the House of Knight's Embrace, located in Tashluta in the southernmost reach of Faerun. The Plague Rats are one of the church's elite organizations, a group of assassins, thieves, and were-rats who operate through the north and the western heartlands. Lycanthropy and Talonite service are not an obvious combination, but the church has historically welcomed those infected with were-rat lycanthropy because the disease connection is theologically meaningful, and the practical combination of a disease-spreading humanoid and the social access that thieves and assassins provide is useful. The internal theological emphasis of the faith is the specific doctrinal claim that death is more powerful than life and should be paid proper homage and respect. Not that life has no value, the balance is acknowledged, but that death is the true power, the great equalizer, the lesson that waits for everyone. The followers of Plague and order within the faith take this further. They experience pain as pleasure. They have trained or been trained or simply been shaped by years of deliberately exposing themselves to their goddess's domain until the ordinary human distinction between suffering and satisfaction no longer applies in the expected way. The Kiputito episode and the consolidation of Plague. In 33 DR in the pre-Dale Reckoning era, a divine power named Kiputito, sister of Loviatar, which adds its own texture to Talona's complicated relationship with that particular goddess, challenged Talona for her portfolio. This challenge was not a political negotiation or a legal dispute in the divine order. Kiputito attacked directly. The battleground was Azram, one of the surviving city-states of fallen Netheril, still operating under Netherese magical traditions in the centuries following that empire's collapse. The conflict was expressed as plague, competing divine diseases deployed against the same population, each goddess attempting to generate the worship of desperate and dying people as a source of divine power. Talona won. Kiputito's plagues eventually overcame Azram's clerical healing resources and killed the entire population within a month. Even those who fled the city died of disease shortly after. The conflict annihilated a surviving Netherese state as its collateral damage. Kiputito was not merely defeated but murdered by Talona, and in the years that followed, theological texts began appearing that described Kiputito not as a separate deity, but as an alias of Talona herself, the ultimate territorial assertion, the defeated competitor retroactively transformed into an aspect of the victor. Kiputito was Finnish in origin, drawn from the same well of real-world mythological material that shaped several of D&D's early divine figures, and Talona's absorption of her is one of the cleaner examples of how the Forgotten Realms handles competing divine claims to similar portfolios. The lesson the episode taught was straightforward. The portfolio of disease has one owner in Faerun, and challenging that ownership is an invitation to become an example. In the centuries since, no significant divine challenger to Talona's domain has emerged within the Faerunian pantheon. Elsewhere, in Greyhawk, the Black Rider in Kabulos holds territory that overlaps in uncomfortable ways, but that is a different world, and its plagues are someone else's problem. The Rotting War and Magical Plague. The Rotting War, fought in Chondath from 900 DR to 902 DR, is one of the most instructive examples in Faerunian history of what happens when magic and plague combine in a military context. The conflict was a civil war between the coastal and inland city-states of Chondath, unremarkable by the standards of the realm's history until 901 DR, when the arch-wizards of Arabar and Reth decided that conventional military approaches were insufficient and reached into Netherese magical traditions to deploy necromantic plagues as weapons. The resulting epidemic killed 2/3 of the Kondathan armies in minutes. This number is not hyperbole. It is the number recorded in the chronicles of the three bards who documented the battles of the Fields of Nun, where the forces of Reth clashed with the joint armies of Arabar and Hlath, 2/3 of combined armies in minutes. This is what magical plague deployment looks like at scale. The plagues did not stay on the battlefield. Soldiers who survived carried the infection home to cities and agricultural regions. Entire counties and baronies were eventually wiped out. The Chondalwood region in particular was devastated in ways that lasted generations. The nation of Chondath fractured entirely, its cities declaring independence and reverting to their previous status as loosely allied city-states. The political structure destroyed by the epidemiological consequences of the war rather than by the war itself. 4 centuries later, in 1317 DR, when the Great Plague of the Inner Sea arrived and devastated the southern coast of the Inner Sea, infecting Chesenta, Unther, Termish, and the Vilhan Reach with what would come to be called the Plague of Dragons, some investigators suggested that the source was a surviving sample of the Rotting War's magical plague strains. If true, this would make the Rotting War arguably the most consequential military deployment of plague in Faerunian history, its consequences still manifesting 400 years later in the suffering of populations that had no knowledge of the civil war that produced them. Others attributed the Great Plague of the Inner Sea to different causes. A dragon called the Wandering Worm appeared in the east of the Inner Sea in 1317 DR and spread disease everywhere it traveled, leaving different afflictions in different regions. A ravaging illness in Aglarond, a disease in Impilter that infested victims with maggots before transforming them into undead, and the Plague of Dragons in the south. The disease infected the skin with scaling and flaking, brought hair loss, and drove the afflicted into madness. Knights sent to combat the Wandering Worm returned to their homes as maggot-infested undead, spreading the affliction to cities that had not yet encountered it. Queen Ilione Olosin of Aglarond died of the plague in 1320 DR, making her the last of the Olosin dynasty. The Red Wizards of Thay withdrew from an ongoing military occupation of the Wizards' Reach, specifically to protect themselves from the spreading infection, one of the more remarkable strategic retreats in the organization's history, driven not by military defeat but by biological threat. By 1323 DR, the Great Plague had mostly ended, though it persisted in Chesenta and Unther through 1324 DR. The populations of the old empires had been decimated. Chesenta did not recover to pre-plague population levels for a generation. All of this is attributed in the conventional theological framework to Talona. The Great Plague was her work, or at least her blessing, or at minimum her failure to prevent something that she could have stopped. The Year of the Wandering Worm and its aftermath mark one of the clearest peaks of Talonite worship in the realm's recorded history. How disease works in a world with clerics. The presence of clerical healing magic creates a specific tension in how disease functions in the Forgotten Realms that does not exist in worlds without divine intervention. If a cleric can remove disease with a touch, why does plague remain a genuine threat? If healing magic is widely available, why does the Lady of Poison retain any power at all? The answer operates at several levels. First, clerics are not infinitely available. The major temples cluster in cities. Rural areas may not have a cleric of sufficient power or the right divine connection to treat magical diseases effectively. The Talonite plagues most frequently ravage the populations that are furthest from the clerical infrastructure concentrated in urban centers. Second, not all diseases are equal. Natural diseases can be treated with clerical magic. Magical diseases, supernatural contagions sent by divine will or created through specific necromantic techniques, resist ordinary clerical treatment in ways that require progressively more powerful or specifically aligned healing. A disease that Talona sends personally is not the same category of problem as marsh fever. Third, and most practically, clerics are expensive. The wealthy and well-connected die at lower rates from plague outbreaks because they can afford the fees. The poor die at higher rates because they cannot. This creates a specific theological dynamic where disease, in practice, functions as an equalizer that targets the unprotected, and the clerics who could protect the unprotected are concentrated among those who can pay for their services. The maritime plague protocols of the Inner Sea reflect the practical management of this situation at the institutional level. Ships carrying plague were required to signal their status by smearing blood or red paint on their sails, giving other vessels warning to provide healing if available, or destroy the infected vessel if it was not. Along the Sword Coast, a black flag meant plague aboard, requiring quarantine and clerical intervention upon arrival at port. These are not improvised responses to rare emergencies. They are codified procedures for a recognized ongoing risk, maintained by societies that live with plague as a permanent background condition rather than an anomaly. The spotted plague outbreak in Iriabor in 1367 DR is the positive example in the records. Churches banded together and coordinated a response that stopped the outbreak with few casualties, demonstrating that when clerical resources are deployed rapidly and cooperatively, even significant outbreaks can be contained. The Great Plague of the Inner Sea is the negative example, a plague of sufficient divine magnitude spread across too wide an area too quickly, outrunning both the clerical infrastructure and the diplomatic coordination required to mount a joint response. The cosmology of Rot. Talona's divine realm is called the Palace of Poison Tears. Under the cosmology of the Great Wheel, it sits in Cathris, the second layer of Carceri, the prison plane, the layer known for jungle-covered orbs saturated with poisonous vegetation. This is not accidental placement. Carceri is where gods and entities are imprisoned, where the dangerous things that cannot be destroyed but must be contained are kept. Talona is a prisoner in the sense that her portfolio is its own captivity. She cannot leave what she is, cannot escape the cycle of plague and worship and diminishment and plague again, trapped in the logic of her own divine nature as surely as anything else Carceri holds. Her palace sits in a jungle that kills. The vegetation is poisonous, the air is thick with spores, the landscape itself is an expression of her domain, and the realm functions as an extension of the goddess's character, beautiful in the way that things that could kill you can be beautiful, overwhelming in its fecundity, the visible evidence of what happens when the principle of poison is given infinite space to express itself. Incabulos, the Black Rider of Greyhawk, maintains his realm in an entirely different part of the cosmology, Charnel House on Oinos, the first layer of the Grey Waste of Hades. His approach to disease is not Talona's approach. Where Talona is petulant and attention-seeking, Incabulos is genuinely alien in his malevolence. He feeds on suffering directly, his divine power deriving from illness, famine, nightmares, and all the varieties of misery his portfolio encompasses. He is feared by the demon princes of the abyss and the archdevils of Bator, which is a remarkable statement about how the divine hierarchy assesses him. Even beings of tremendous evil find him too much. He hates all other gods without distinction. He tolerates Nerul, god of death, only because Nerul finishes the work. Incabulos begins. There is a grim professional courtesy in this, the plague god and the death god in the unspoken partnership of suffering followed by ending. His realm stinks of corpses. Anyone who enters it finds their deepest fears materializing around them. He rides a nightmare, attended by night hags, and anyone who meets his eyes is afflicted with permanent sleep that only exorcism can lift. These are the two major divine powers of plague in D&D. One operating from wounded vanity and the hunger for attention, one from something darker and less comprehensible. The gap between them is a gap between a goddess you can predict and a god you can only fear. The weight of plague on Farunian civilization. Disease shapes the Forgotten Realms in ways that go beyond the theological and reach into the political and social texture of the world. Every major city has plague protocols. Every ship captain knows the maritime signal codes for infected vessels. Every noble with sufficient paranoia and sufficient funds employs a food taster, which means employing someone who has made peace with the possibility of dying in their employer's service by ingestion which tends to attract a specific kind of person, and Talonite clergy are the most reliably effective candidates for this role, given their divine protection against exactly the thing the job requires: surviving. The political consequences of plague outbreaks in Faerunian history are extensive. The rotting war left Chondath a fractured ruin. The Great Plague of the Inner Sea ended dynasties, forced military withdrawals, and reshaped the demographic balance of the old empires in ways that their subsequent history had to accommodate. The Year of the Scourge, the Year of Clinging Death, the repeated peaks of Talonite devotion, each of these marks a period of political instability in the affected regions, because plague and political stability are enemies. People dying in large numbers, trade routes interrupted, agricultural seasons lost to abandonment of the fields, the healthy fleeing cities to avoid the sick. All of this is the political infrastructure of a kingdom disintegrating at its foundations, and Talona has been the mechanism behind multiple such disintegrations across the realm's recorded history. What is perhaps most interesting from the perspective of understanding how Faerun actually works is the dual nature of the Talonite Church as both cause and partial solution. The same organization that will deliberately cause a plague in a city that expelled one of its members also provides the most disease-specialized healing clergy in the realms. The same goddess who sends illness when her worship flags accepts prayers for protection from that illness and sometimes heeds them. The Lady of Poison is both the threat and the insurance against the threat, which is an extraordinary position for any divine entity to hold, and which explains why she is one of the most prayed to deities in the pantheon, even by people who have never and would never choose to worship her. In a world where disease has a face and opinions, you pay the tribute. You drop 3 drops of blood into the well. You paint her symbol on the door of the infected house, not because you believe in her theology, but because the alternative that she notices you failed to acknowledge her is worse than the gesture costs. Talona accepts the fear. She has always accepted the fear. In many ways, the fear is the point. Kipatito's legacy and the politics of divine portfolio. The erasure of Kipatito from the divine record is worth dwelling on because it illuminates something about how theological power works in the Forgotten Realms that the major pantheon entries tend to obscure. Kipatito was, by whatever standard applies to divine beings, a real entity with a real portfolio and a real claim to the domain she occupied. Her conflict with Talona in Minas 33 DR was not a misunderstanding or a boundary dispute between allies who disagreed about terrain. Kipatito attacked. She chose Azram as the battlefield and deployed her own plagues against Talona's, each goddess trying to generate more devotional power from the same dying population than the other. And Talona's response was not merely to win the conflict. It was to retroactively eliminate the competition's legitimacy by assimilating her into Talona's own divine identity. The texts written after the conflict describe Kipatito as one of Talona's names, an alias, a previous aspect. In this theological framework, Kipatito never actually existed as an independent entity. She was Talona's shadow, or Talona's past self, or some expression of Talona's power that temporarily operated under a different identity before being reintegrated. The historical reality of a divine conflict, a genuine struggle for portfolio control that devastated an entire nation as its collateral damage, gets written out of the record in favor of a narrative that makes Talona always have been the only one. This is not unique to Talona. The Forgotten Realms' divine history is full of cases where the victor in a divine conflict gets to write the subsequent theology. But the specific mechanism here, transforming a rival into an alias rather than simply acknowledging their defeat, is unusually thoroughgoing. Kipatito is not a goddess who lost. She is a name that Talona sometimes uses. The distinction matters to no one who experienced the Year of Clinging Death, which killed an entire nation's population as the battlefield for this dispute, but it matters a great deal to the subsequent theological tradition. The practical consequence is that Talona's grip on the disease portfolio in Faerun is essentially total. There is no legitimate rival. There is no competing church that could plausibly claim divine mandate to heal plague, specifically from a position of divine authority over disease itself. The only opposition comes from the gods, whose portfolios are in structural conflict with hers. Chauntea, Miliki, Ilmater, and none of these deities claim disease as their territory. They oppose it from the outside, which is a position of permanent disadvantage against a deity who owns the inside. How ordinary people experience plague. The academic analysis of plague theology is one way to understand what disease means in the Forgotten Realms. The view from inside a city experiencing an outbreak is another, and it is worth examining what ordinary Faerunian citizens actually do when the sickness comes. The first response is prayer. Not necessarily Talonite prayer. The conventional wisdom of the realms is that you pray to any deity whose portfolio is relevant to your situation, and in a plague, the relevant portfolios include Talona herself, Ilmater for endurance of suffering, Kelemvor for a clean passage to death if the worst happens, and Chauntea in the hope that the agricultural contagion affecting the crops will spare the household garden. You cover your bases. The 3 drops of blood or tears offered to Talona are not acts of devotion. They are insurance premiums paid to a deity who can hurt you if she thinks you are not taking her seriously. The second response is quarantine. Ships that arrive in port flying the black flag are met by harbor authorities and clerics rather than merchants. Families in cities with recognized outbreaks mark their doors with the infected symbol, which is also Talona's symbol, which produces the specific uncomfortable situation where the act of signaling sickness is simultaneously an act of acknowledging her. In frontier regions, someone who is obviously badly diseased may simply be killed as a preventive measure, with the theological justification that Talona has already claimed them and delay only risks claiming their neighbors. The third response, for those with means, is evacuation. The wealthy leave cities during plague outbreaks. They go to country estates where the population is less dense and the air is less thick with whatever is spreading the contagion. They take their food tasters with them. They do not go back until the reports from the city suggest the worst has passed. The fourth response, if you are a Talonite priest or simply someone who has made their peace with proximity to disease, is the work of the plague time itself, treating the sick, burying the dead, maintaining the infrastructure of survival in a city where significant portions of the population may be incapacitated simultaneously. This is genuinely valuable labor, and it is genuinely dangerous for anyone without divine protection, which is why the Talonite clergy who offer it can charge significant fees and do. The plague marking on houses, the 3 drops in a triangle on the door of an infected household, creates a specific visual grammar of contagion in plague-time cities. Streets where infected households cluster become streets other people avoid. The markings spread until entire neighborhoods are marked, and the spatial pattern of the epidemic becomes readable in the city's own face. People who have traveled in several plague-time cities develop the skill of reading these patterns quickly, knowing from the arrangement of marked doors which streets are too dense with infection to risk, and which seem to be resolving. The maritime signaling is its own layer of spatial plague reading. Ships smearing blood or red paint on their sails on the inner sea are legible at a distance, giving other vessels enough warning to avoid contact, offer healing if available, or prepare fire arrows if the situation is beyond clerical capacity. The specific decision about whether to heal or burn a plague ship is not an easy one. The crews of infected vessels are people, and burning them alive is not an act that sits lightly, even in a world where disease can spread like fire. But the calculus of containment can produce this outcome, and the maritime traditions of the inner sea reflect a society that has been through this calculation enough times to have written protocols for it. Disease in the Underdark. The Underdark presents a specific set of conditions for disease that makes it distinct from the surface world. Primarily the density of population in confined spaces, the absence of sunlight, and the presence of biological entities whose relationship with infection is fundamentally different from surface-dwelling creatures. The Drow cities, particularly Menzoberranzan, operate with the specific plague management logic of deeply authoritarian city-states that have access to powerful magic. Outbreaks that would devastate a surface city can be contained in a Drow city through the combination of magical quarantine, the ready availability of healing through Lolth's clergy, and the specific willingness of drow nobility to sacrifice large numbers of lower-class drow to contain a threat to the noble houses. The mathematics of plague containment in Menzoberranzan are not the same as the mathematics in Waterdeep, because the acceptable casualty threshold among the enslaved and lower caste population is effectively unlimited. The Underdark's other inhabitants have their own relationships with disease. The Mind Flayers, operating through their elder brains, monitor the health of their thrall populations with the attentiveness of any organism that depends on functional stock for its labor force. A diseased thrall is a useless thrall, and the elder brain's investment in the maintenance of slave stock health is not compassion, but practicality. The Grey Dwarves, the Duergar, developed their grim constitution partly through generations of existence in the deep places where supernatural afflictions are common enough to select strongly for resistance. The Myconids, the fungal folk of the deep places, have a relationship with disease that is categorically different from anything on the surface. Their biology makes the distinction between infection and symbiosis unclear in ways that surface biology does not. They spread spores. They communicate through spores. The line between a myconid colony dispersing its biological material and a myconid colony causing an outbreak of something that human lungs cannot handle is not a line that myconids themselves are necessarily equipped to perceive. Talona has limited presence in the Underdark in terms of active priesthood, but her domain reaches there as surely as disease reaches there, which is to say, completely. The darkness does not protect against plague. The stone does not protect against plague. What the Underdark has instead of surface world Talonite clerics is a different set of practitioners. Mind Flayer scholars who study disease for its utility in managing thrall populations, drow poisoners whose relationship with toxin and infection is pragmatic and technical rather than theological, and the various unique fungi and molds and biological agents that the deep places have been developing in isolation for longer than most surface civilizations have existed. The disease of the Spellplague and Divine Plague. The Spellplague of 1385 DR was not a biological disease in the conventional sense. It was a magical catastrophe, the result of Mistra's assassination by Cyric, aided by Shar, and the consequent detonation of the divine weave that had structured arcane magic across the realms, but it behaved like a disease in its spread, its symptoms, and its long-term consequences. The Shar connection is worth noting in this context. The same goddess who had cultivated an alliance with Talona was also instrumental in triggering the event that most closely resembled a world-spanning plague in the realm's history. Whether this is theological coincidence or some expression of Shar's broader interest in loss and devastation is a question the sources leave open. The blue fire spread across the face of Faerun like an advancing infection, transforming the terrain and the people it touched in chaotic and unpredictable ways. The plague changed, people physically transformed by immersion in the wild magic of the Spellplague, bore the marks of the catastrophe in their bodies for the rest of their lives, in ways that had a direct parallel to the lasting physical effects of the more severe natural diseases. The cosmological scars left on the landscape, the wild magic zones called spell-scarred terrain, persisted for decades in the way that the aftermath of a major plague persists, not in the active infection, but in the damage done, the populations not yet recovered, the economic and political consequences still unfolding. Talona played no role in the Spellplague. This is significant. The event that most closely resembled a world-spanning plague in the history of the realms was entirely outside her portfolio and power, which is a reminder that the Lady of Poison's domain, vast as it is in the context of biological disease, does not encompass every form of mass affliction. The Spellplague was Mistra's death made manifest, a divine catastrophe on a scale that Talona's attention to the cycles of worship and power did not position her to influence. The Spellplague's aftermath also produced a generation of spell-scarred people, individuals who bore the mark of wild magic in their bodies, their spell-casting unreliable or transformed, their physical forms sometimes altered into something that the rest of the population found alarming. The social treatment of spell-scarred individuals in the century following the Spellplague drew heavily on the existing social grammar of disease, the quarantine instinct, the visual marking, the mixture of fear and occasional exploitation. People who look like they have been touched by something dangerous get treated like they have been touched by something dangerous, regardless of whether what touched them was biological or cosmological. Talona's price. When the rotting war ended, Chandath was fractured and never fully healed. When the great plague of the inner sea ran its course, dynasties had fallen and populations had been decimated across 6 nations. When Kipatito challenged Talona's domain, an entire country ceased to exist as a functioning civilization. These are what the records call Talona's price, the cost of letting the worship lapse, of failing to take the goddess of disease seriously, of treating plague as something that happens to other people or that ended in the previous generation and will not happen again. The price is always calibrated to the severity of the disrespect and the magnitude of the accumulated neglect, which is to say, it is not calibrated to anything rational at all because the goddess setting it has the emotional architecture of a petulant child who has been ignored. The lesson is not that worshiping Talona is safe. Her priesthood can tell you that it is not. Worship Talona deeply enough and she will mark your body, the tattoos, the scars, the specific claim that devoted service leaves on the priest who performs it. She accepts the offering and changes the offerer. This is not the relationship people who pray to Lathander or Timora are looking for when they seek divine connection. Talona does not promise blessings. She promises that acknowledging her costs less than ignoring her. In a world where the gods are real and their attentions have direct material consequences, this is enough. The 3 drops of blood or tears go into the well. The symbol gets painted on the door of the infected house. The prayer gets said, not with love, but with the specific quality of attention that something with the power to devastate cities deserves from people who would prefer not to be devastated. Talona receives the fear. She has always received the fear. In the theology of the mother of all plagues, that is all she has ever needed. Names that have no cure. Ferunian diseases have names, and the names are worth knowing because they tell you something about the world that produced them. Featherlung is one of the three plagues, the trio of diseases most commonly referenced together across Ferunian medical and religious literature, alongside spotted plague and shaking plague. Featherlung spreads through inhalation, takes between 1 and 3 days to incubate, and fills the lungs with a softness that sounds harmless and is not. Spotted plague spreads through injury, a cut, a bite, contact with infected blood, and incubates over several days before its characteristic markings appear. Shaking plague, not to be confused with shaking fever, which is a different illness entirely, is the third of the trio. These 3 diseases recur in the historical record wherever conditions are favorable, meaning crowded, meaning pores, meaning the kind of urban density that creates natural infrastructure for contagion to propagate. Black tongue spreads through ingestion, contaminated food, tainted water, and takes between 1 and 4 days to reveal itself. Dark rot, which some sources call gangrene, spreads through injury and incubates in a single day. Green rot, known in some regions as scaly death, is a contact disease that manifests quickly. Marsh fever, salar, or typhus spreads through injury in the broadest sense, meaning through the bite of infected insects in the marsh environments that breed them, and takes between 3 and 18 days to incubate, which is a range that makes tracking the source of any given outbreak extremely difficult. Foam jaws is rabies by another name, spreading through injury, the bite of infected animals, and incubating over a week to 10 days. Flesh rot, the mummy disease, spreads through contact and takes several days to manifest. These are the diseases with entries in the medical literature, like the ones that healers and scholars have cataloged sufficiently to name. The diseases that have not been cataloged, the ones that the Talonite clergy are constantly seeking in new configurations in isolated regions, the ones that emerged from magical experimentation or divine intervention and do not fit the established taxonomy, these have no names yet, or names known only to the priests who found them and added them to the private records of the church. The plague of dragons that ran through Chicenta and the Vilhan Reach in 1317 DR had the specific symptom profile scaling skin, hair loss, madness that gave it its name, And the name stuck because the visual resemblance to something dragonic in a region full of dragon lore was irresistible to the people experiencing it. Whether the disease had anything to do with dragons was less certain than the name suggested. Some blamed the wandering worm that moved through the inner sea in that year. Some blamed surviving samples of the Rotting War's magical plague strains from 4 centuries earlier. Some blamed Talona. The Talonite clergy, for their part, found the attribution flattering and did not actively discourage it. The theology of respect. The specific theological term the Talantar use for what they want from the world is respect. Not love, not devotion, in the sense that the word implies chosen affiliation and genuine spiritual alignment. Respect, the acknowledgement that the power exists, that it can hurt you, that failing to acknowledge it has consequences. This is a more honest theology than many. The God of justice asks you to believe that justice is good. The goddess of love asks you to participate in the mystery of connection. Talona asks you to recognize that disease is real and that she controls it. She is asking you to acknowledge a fact rather than a value, which makes her theology paradoxically more verifiable than most. You can test whether disease is real, whether ignoring Talona's church invites consequences, whether the 3 drops of blood or tears in the tainted well make any discernible difference in outcomes. The church's position is that the respect is owed because Talona's potentially devastating abilities are real, and her representatives in Faerun deserve to be treated as the agents of a genuine divine power. The subtext, the thing that the Talonite clergy communicate through action rather than doctrine, is that the respect is also purchasing something. Cities that maintain a functional Talonite presence, that allow the clergy to operate and do not persecute them, have historically had better plague outcomes than cities that expelled the Talantar and subsequently found themselves dealing with the theological price Talona exacts for insults to her church. Whether this reflects divine intervention, Talona punishing cities that mistreated her clergy, or simply reflects that cities with functioning Talonite clergy have better disease management capacity, is a question that the Church has no interest in examining too closely. The faith's internal instruction for its members captures the ambiguity cleanly. Let pain be as pleasure, for life and death are in balance, but death is the more powerful and should be paid proper homage and respect. Death is the true power, the great equalizer, the lesson that waits for all. Work in her name and let the doings be subtle or spectacular as the situation requires. Subtle or spectacular. Most of the Church's work is subtle, the quiet travel across Faerun, the careful documentation of new diseases, the medical services provided to people who do not ask too many questions about who is doing the treating and why. Spectacular happens when a city makes the mistake of casting out a Talonite priest and discovering what Talona's price looks like in practice. Spectacular is what the year of clinging death was for Azram. Spectacular is what the Rotting War became when magical plague was deployed as a weapon. The records of Faerun contain both kinds. The balance between them depends, in the theology of the Mother of all plagues, on whether the world is paying sufficient attention. The world is usually paying sufficient attention. The cost of insufficient attention is well established. Why disease endures. The Forgotten Realms could theoretically be a world where disease has been eradicated. The magical capacity exists, in principle, to imagine a civilization that has deployed clerical healing widely enough and consistently enough to suppress the most devastating diseases below the threshold of epidemic. Some of the most magically advanced periods in the realm's history came close to this, in certain well-served cities for certain privileged populations. But the structure of the world prevents it at scale. Magic is not evenly distributed. Clerics are not infinite. The Talantar, whose existence depends on disease remaining a real and present threat, are actively working to prevent exactly the scenario where plague is fully contained. And Talona herself, whose divine power waxes specifically when plague is widespread and desperate prayer is abundant, has a direct incentive to maintain the conditions that sustain her. This is the cosmic logic of Pestilence in the Forgotten Realms. Disease persists not because it is invincible, but because the divine entity whose power depends on it actively maintains its presence. Every plague is both a natural phenomenon with biological causes and a theological statement about what the world owes the Lady of Poison. Every cure is both a medical achievement and a small reduction in the divine portfolio of the Mistress of Disease. The herbalist who finds a treatment for marsh fever, the cleric who successfully stops a spotted plague outbreak, the Ilmatari monks who develop a new protocol for disease containment, all of these are, in Talona's theological framework, her enemies. She accepts this. The enemies who reduce her power locally simply make the next outbreak more necessary. The cycle turns, the worship returns. The 3 drops fall into the well or into the fire or into the mouth of the sick child, and the prayer goes up, and somewhere in Carceri, in a palace saturated with poison, the Lady of Poison receives what she has always been owed. The attention, the respect, the knowledge that whatever you have built, however many prayers you have said to however many other gods, the plague that is coming will find you in it, unless she decides otherwise. And that, in the theology of the Mother of all plagues, in the daily lived experience of everyone in Faerun who has ever watched a well go bad or a crop fail or a fever come to a city and not leave, is why she is prayed to more than gods with better intentions and worse leverage. She has leverage. She has always had leverage. The world knows it.